You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 30th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, we'll begin with an examination of the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon. Can a full-blown crisis be averted? Italy and China have signed a new 3-year economic agreement plan. We'll hear more about Giorgia Meloni's trip to Beijing. Then,
we're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
JD Vance, Trump's pick for vice president, is being dogged by cats. Could he be fired before he even gets the job? We'll have a roundup of Norwegian news and a check-in with our Paris studio at Maison Alliance. Plus,
I think the role of our towns, cities and governments should try to be keeping our heads up and looking at our surroundings and engaging in the real world around us. I think maybe this measure might be pushing people more towards their screens.
We'll hear more about a Swiss city's push to ban on-street commercial advertising. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says he is the winner of the election, giving him a third term in office and extending 25 years of Socialist Party rule, a result the opposition and protesters challenge. US Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's campaign will launch a $10 million advertising blitz in 6 battleground states this week as it tries to counter a surge of voter enthusiasm and donations for his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. And Morocco's King Mohammed VI has ordered the release of 3 jailed journalists as part of a pardon benefiting 2,476 convicts. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed a harsh response to the rocket strike that killed 12 children as he visited the site in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights on Monday. The attack was reportedly carried out by the Lebanese Shia Islamist political party and militia group Hezbollah, which is one of the most heavily armed non-state military forces in the world. It's funded and equipped by Iran. Well, I'm joined now by Renard Mansour, who's a research fellow in the Middle East and North Africa programme and project director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. Renard, many thanks for coming on the show. This round of hostilities with Hezbollah began on October the 8th. I wondered if you could just give us a quick broad outline of what's happened since then.
Sure. It's been, several months, as you say, of posturing, of rhetoric, of dangerous rhetoric. Hezbollah, Israel claiming at times that they are part of a war. From Hezbollah's perspective, it's part of a resistance. Its very nature, its creation is to resist against Israel. And so it's been a very tense situation in Lebanon and also other groups linked to sort of Iran and the axis of resistance in Iraq and Yemen with the Houthis in Syria. So it's been very, very tense. And so the fear has been that something could spark it. So while it's been clear that, Hezbollah, this has been posturing and rhetoric rather than a genuine sort of willingness to go to war, it has led to a kind of environment in the Middle East where many fear something could spark, more direct confrontation.
And of course, this is exactly what happened when this strike hit these children and others playing football.
Yeah, exactly. And, people thought, again, and this is often used with Lebanon, Lebanon is on the brink. People were starting to, in Lebanon, going to the airports, we're anticipating some kind of response. Of course, Israel has been bombing southern Lebanon since, October 8th. And so, it's been interesting to see Hezbollah's response. They have not, they've denied it vehemently. They've said it's not us. It's many people are saying that this could have been an accident, a drone that went awry, and not an intentional attack on this sort of Israeli occupied area. However, this is exactly what the fear is, that it doesn't necessarily have to be something intentional or strategic, but a mistake could lead to regional escalation.
And I mean, if that was a mistake, would that then be consistent with opinions that Hezbollah is really not trying to prompt an all-out war with Israel?
Yes, that has been the case. And also, it's the Americans and others have been very sort of active in this field of trying to, remove tensions, try to calm things down, negotiating in backroom deals. They do not want the war currently, in Palestine to bleed into Lebanon and elsewhere. So there has been intense diplomatic efforts to stop Lebanon from descending into the war. And Hezbollah has been a part of that, saying that they're, at the moment, it's not good for their business. It's not good for what's happening from their perspectives in Lebanon to now be at war with Israel and potentially destabilize the power they have domestically.
And what about Israel? I mean, with troops occupied in Gaza, does it have the resources to open another offensive?
Yeah, it's been a very, from Israel's perspective, it's been a war, an intense war, of course, on Gaza. Public opinion is a big issue for Israel's leadership. Opening up a new front, this is a conscript army with many families impacted by having soldiers in war. Opening up a new front, opening up a new war isn't necessarily of interest to Israelis. However, of course, we do know that someone like the president, Netanyahu, sees this war as linked to his legitimacy, as linked to his future career, and so seeks to continue this war and continue posturing as a way of keeping power domestically.
Lebanon is in a precarious state, economically and politically. Is the country in any position to support a war, and how do civilians in Lebanon feel about this?
I mean, civilians in Lebanon are just sick and tired of war. I mean, this is a country that has had, many years of civil war, many years of conflict with Israel, years of in the region, the Syrian crisis. There's been conflict after conflict, and many Lebanese, have also seen domestically corruption lead to things like a port explosion, a financial crash. It's been very difficult, and the lives of many Lebanese has become very difficult. So yes, the state cannot sort of handle this. The people don't want this, which is largely also why Hezbollah has to kind of cater to the domestic audience. And so Lebanon is often described as being on the brink, and it's been decades and decades where people describe Lebanon on the brink. And so people do feel that they are at times living on this brink. Of course, it's managed to the system has proven to be resilient in a strange way, given that it's so many different crashes and conflicts. However, it's very, the people are dreading what could come next.
Now, most commercial airlines have stopped flying into Beirut. American and German citizens have been warned to leave. I think others are going to follow. Clearly, as you say, the international community is worried about this. But what pressure is being applied to both parties to rack down the tension?
Well, it's, as I said, the U.S. has been active in this. European sort of leaders have been active in trying to tell, Netanyahu and Israel that do not invade southern Lebanon. On the other side, Hezbollah has also been told and sort of confirmed that it is not interested in moving not interested in any wider confrontation. There is no appetite for regional escalation. However, there is still this posturing, which is important for both sides to kind of maintain that front.
If Israel did go into Lebanon, would it need US support to do so? And can it rely on that?
Well, Israel has a very bad precedent in 2006 of, when it sort of attacked Lebanon and Hezbollah, and kind of it backfired, and that really empowered Hezbollah. Hezbollah became more powerful the last time Israel really tried to invade and attack it. So Israel, of course, is the strongest military in the region by far. Its technologies are unparalleled to others in the region. However, this is not just a war of numbers and a war of military. It will be very difficult for Hezbollah to invade and to occupy again these areas that it occupied in the past. Of course, it has been bombing the southern Lebanon consistently since October 7th, 8th. And so, yes, of course, there could be a quick military win, but that longer term occupation could actually benefit Hezbollah as it did in 2006.
So it's interesting you bring up 2006 because at the end of that, there was a UN Security Council resolution, 1701, which effectively ended that war. But some parts of it to do with withdrawal and establishing a sort of buffer zone have never been implemented. Could a hasty revisiting of that keep the peace?
Yeah, I mean, there have been UN forces, of course, there, peacekeeping sort of forces in that part of southern Lebanon, trying to sort of maintain some kind of peace. It has, they've called it a kind of not a complete peace, but a sort of cold war in a way. They had never declared peace, on either side. They've still considered themselves in a war, but a war that they don't actually for the most part, attack each other as such. But there have been over the years back and forth, of course, rockets back and forth. And so it's never been a peace. And, part of this is both sides' legitimacy is based on being at war with each other.
Yeah.
And, Hezbollah formed as a resistance to Israel and will continue to be a resistance to Israel. It's an important part of its narrative and Israel as well. So I think, the UN, it will be difficult to see the UN really taking more of a stance on establishing a more permanent peace.
And Renan, I suppose the real question is, should Israel retaliate? Would that necessarily mean a war with Iran and what Tehran calls the rest of the axis of resistance?
Well, Tehran is also in a very difficult position because it's also not, has proven that it and its axis of resistance does not necessarily want all-out war. When Kataib Hezbollah, one of its groups in the axis of resistance, killed 3 Americans along the Jordanian-Syrian border, Iran summoned Kataib Hezbollah and made it sort of declare a ceasefire. So it also is, posturing in a way, and there is this axis, this regional infrastructure that is pointing its guns and drones and missiles at Israel. But we also know that Iran is very careful and very strategic in looking a bit more in the long term of the sort of consequences if it does this. So yes, if Israel invades Lebanon, I think that is a game changer. I think Iran, Hezbollah, its allies will have to respond, but it would still be I think in a de-escalatory kind of mindset.
Renan, thank you very much indeed. That's Renan Mansour there, and this is The Globalist. It is 15:13 in Beijing, 7:13 here in London. In 2019, Italy became the only group of 7 countries to join China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, but it withdrew last year. Now, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is midway through a visit to Beijing to relaunch cooperation by signing a 3-year action plan. Well, I'm joined now by Amy Kasman, who's the Financial Times Rome correspondent. Amy, good morning to you. Many thanks for coming on the show. Why did Italy pull out from Xi's flagship programme, the Belt and Road, in December?
Well, when Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative, it actually caused a huge outcry, particularly in the West and also within many people in Italy's own security and geostrategic policy establishment. Italy is a G7 member country. Italy is a member of NATO. And the decision to join the BRI was taken by a very iconoclastic populist government led by the Five Star Movement, which was more pro-China and anti-West in its sympathies. And but many people thought that this was a mistake, and that in a situation of growing global tensions between Washington, which is Italy's most important strategic partner, and China, it was just impossible for Italy to be a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is seen as an investment and infrastructure development initiative, but also has huge strategic implications. So there was a big outcry at the time. Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister, said that she thought that the extension to the BRI was a mistake. And when the 3-year term of initial membership was due to expire, she announced that Italy wanted to pull out.
What will this new economic agreement that they've signed then cover? What are the nuts and bolts of it?
Well, I think that the nuts and bolts are actually quite fuzzy. It's kind of a general promise to cooperate on various things, from electric vehicles. Giorgia Meloni is interested in talking with the Chinese about artificial intelligence regulation, which is one of her kind of pet concerns about the potential of AI replacing humans. But in general, I think the idea of this trip is essentially, after the turbulence of the last few years, to put relations between Rome and Beijing on a kind of friendly, even keel. So there's lots of pronouncements about potential cooperation, but none of it has the kind of real significance that the BRI did.
You talk about the car industry, but Italy supported the European Commission's decision to impose provisional tariffs of up to 37.6% on electric vehicles imported from China. Will that be a problem?
Well, I think that is an issue. The Chinese obviously aren't so keen on those tariffs, but Italy's government is also quite keen on trying to recruit Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers to invest and set up their own production facilities in Italy. So I think she is not going to yield on those tariffs. She's going to continue to support the European line. Her government has a kind of protectionist stance and wants to encourage investment. She has made a lot of comments about unfair trade with China. Italy runs a huge trade deficit with China. So I don't think she's going to yield on that.
I mean, is this a chance for Italy to mend the trade relationship between China and the EU more broadly?
I mean, that is very difficult always. There's always talk about the difficulties with, China's trade deficit, European and Western economies running huge trade deficits with China. It's something always talked.
Sadly, I think we've lost Amy. But still to come on the programme, JD Vance's popularity problem and why one Swiss city is saying no more to billboards. And
I'm Emma Nelson, and I'll be looking ahead to today's Monocle in Paris, where we'll be talking about torches, Olympic logos and Marie Antoinette's bangles.
This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
18 minutes past 7 here in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. This is The Globalist, and we'll continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Steve Crawshaw, who's an author, a journalist and formerly Human Rights Watch UK director. Good morning to you, Steve.
Good morning.
It's been ages. Where have you been?
I've been buried writing a book, and it's just going to the copy editors and publishers now. It's a very exciting moment. So
what's the book?
Being in Monocle this morning is my celebration of the fact of that going off. So,
what's the book?
It's a book on war crimes and justice, prosecuting the powerful. And in the 2 years since I've been writing it, it's got kind of even busier than usual.
I'm quite sure.
So,
Absolutely.
Putin indictments, Netanyahu indictments. What is the? So that's what I've been doing. And you're seeing me wipe the sweat from my brow in the nicest
fantastic.
kind of way.
Well, I can't recommend your book highly enough on how to bring sort of humour and comedy into political protest.
Thank you
What
so
was that
much.
book called? I've forgotten.
Street Spirit.
That's
Street
it.
Spirit,
Fantastic book, and really a handbook for so many people around the world.
It's funny, actually. It's been translated into so many of the big languages less, but the smaller languages, people have picked it up and said, this is what we need in our country, which is really nice. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if Venezuelans will be using it, because, of course, the headlines everywhere today are about the protests which have just kicked off. 2 people killed so far, unfortunately, diplomats being expelled. This is just going to get worse and worse after the election.
It really is. It's kind of sad. So we've got... It's sad, but it's also incredible the energy that there seems to be in Venezuela. I think in past years it was like we can't do anything about it. There was quite low turnout. People were just boycotting. Nothing was going to happen. But as you say, the elections which Nicolas Maduro's government has claimed, he has claimed that they've won completely, and people are saying, no, you haven't. And very interestingly, they've got the numbers to prove it. So they've got lots of the voting forms and things. They've kept the copies. It reminded me a little bit, I mean, there's lots of contrasts, but many years ago, and you mentioned I was a journalist before at The Independent, and I was covering the fall of Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade more than 20 years ago now. And one of the most important things was they had the physical forms hidden away in a secret room. They could prove that they had won and not Milosevic, but he continued to say he eventually lost. But of course, in Belarus, for example, to take another example, again, he stole it. And he's still there. So we don't know which way it'll go yet. But, left-wing governments in Latin America, that's been super interesting as well. Colombia, Brazil, others have said, excuse me, you need to treat this a bit more seriously. Putin is very happy and is congratulating and so on and so forth. So we'll see where it all goes. It's kind of worrying, but if there's a happy ending, this will be amazing good news, but that's a very, very big year for us.
Yeah, those countries are Uruguay, Peru, Panama, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Argentina and Guatemala. They've all denounced the result, which I think is extraordinary.
Yeah, it is remarkable, yeah.
And as you say, the usual suspects are Cuba, Serbia, Nicaragua, Russia, Bolivia and Honduras. Just the results.
It kind of overlaps quite a lot with the kind of countries that said, yes, good that you went into Ukraine, Mr. Putin, it's kind of, you have a certain...
exactly. I mean, I'm laughing about it, but I think this has the potential to be a really nasty fight.
It's very, very dark. And I was also reflecting, it's kind of curious. I mean, I mentioned some of the East European places that I was personally closely observing, or sometimes there. But of course, we have a left-winger who, or what he calls himself a left-winger, saying it belongs to him when it clearly doesn't. And of course, only a few years ago, we had the American president kind of trying to do the same thing. And the contrast there is that America's institutions were very strong, did not allow Trump to steal in the way that he wanted to do. But in a way, of course, he is by nature, he's a kind of Maduro figure. He doesn't really care about truth or lies. And America did have those institutions which stepped in. Venezuela doesn't really, and so it's going to be on the street and to some extent international diplomacy. It's both exciting, but as you say, it is worrying. It could get very, very dark.
Yeah, well, another race that has the potential to get quite dark, and people participating have been warned not to go there, is the Tory infighting here in the UK. Tell us more about this story from The Times and yellow cards.
Yeah, I love this story as well. So I wasn't naturally going to go for these competitions for party leaderships can get a bit dull and inside baseball quite quickly. But I did think it was quite comic. So the 1922 committee, which is the backbenchers committee of the Conservatives, and until recently ruling and now absolutely not ruling, have announced there'll be a yellow card for any leadership candidates for the Conservative Party leadership context, which will finish later this year, if they are doing infighting and saying nasty things or getting others to say nasty things on their behalf. Well, of course, everyone denies these things in any case. I think it's kind of quite sweet. It's a reflection of the fact of what a bad situation they're in, the fact that they need to announce the yellow card system. But as various of the insiders are quoted as saying, it will be impossible to police and is probably likely to cause more problems than it solves, really. Mm-hmm. To be honest, I think the Conservatives are quite a long way from power at any point. They're in such chaos. They're a bit like Labour Party in past years. They're going to need to remake themselves. But at the moment, there's a fight for the soul of the party, with one candidate who's dropped out, Suella Braverman, complaining basically that the party doesn't appreciate her sufficiently with her mad right-wing ideas, and so she's dropped out.
Well, I love that she said they think I'm just mad and dangerous.
I know, it's great.
Remarkable self-knowledge.
Yes, the self-knowledge is wonderful. It a little bit reminds me of a very, very famous poem by Bertolt Brecht after there was a rebellion against the communist regime in East Germany in the 1950s. And a senior official said that the people had disappointed the party by their actions. And Brecht wrote a poem and said, "You're quite right. Why did we not dissolve the people and elect another?" And that was kind of what Braverman wanted to do. Let's dissolve the Conservative Party and create another, because they have disappointed me by not supporting me.
And for those who are not quite as into their sporting knowledge as I am and my quick Google finger, a yellow card is used in several sports and most commonly indicates a warning or a temporary suspension, 2 of them usually, and after that it's a red card. So will they be getting the red?
Exactly. They have no red cards in their pockets. They can kind of have an endless sheaf of yellow cards, but there is no red card. They cannot. Well, technically they can sort of send somebody off the pitch, I suppose. And they warn that they will do that. But you can imagine if this was still Boris Johnson, for example, in the game doing it, he would love to have the red card, a bit like Trump does when he faces prosecution. So I think it's going to be a mess, which will be entertaining to watch, it's fair to say.
Yes, particularly because there's absolutely, as you say, no prospect of them returning to power.
No, it's all quite
soon.
fictional.
Yeah.
It's all quite fictional. You know, both parties have had fictional stages where they kind of bleat on about things and are clearly nowhere in reach of power. It's not just that we've just had an election, but they haven't remotely worked out what to do yet.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on now. And we are looking at US politics, I think. No, let's go to Israel first, because that's way darker, actually, in a way. This is from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and it's talking about Israel becoming, as if it isn't already, a pariah state.
Yeah, really, really interesting piece. Whenever I'm in this studio, I always propaganda and will continue. I think I should get commissioned for their subscriptions. Haaretz, the magnificent Israeli paper. I can never recommend it enough, because I think that people lean so much into what they are thinking, and in their usual reading, here I am and poor Israel is being, traduced by various others, or horrible Israel doing these things. Haaretz is brilliant at seeing it from an Israeli perspective and all of the horror that 7th of October meant for Israel, but also confronting the dark truths which far too many, I was there a couple of months ago for the book, far too many Israelis are failing to confront. And so Haaretz is brilliant on that. So yes, the piece that I singled out and I thought was so interesting by Alan Pincus, former senior Israeli diplomat. He's been an advisor to various prime ministers, foreign ministers, and so on and so forth, Shimon Peres, for example, and others. He, as you say, for Israel, pariah status now beckons. And he talks about the crassness, he's not just talking about the horror that Israel is now inflicting on others, although he's strongly on that, but also how much it's damaging itself. And I think that's extraordinary. He has really, really strong language. Not only did Israel flagrantly, recklessly and myopically avoid any political negotiation policies, actively weaken the authority by strengthening Hamas, in other words, in past years. What the prosecution of the Gaza war did is indisputably bad, but to somehow manage to turn a just and justifiable war into a diplomatic calamity with ongoing probes by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court takes talent. And it goes on with that without parallel in modern relations. It says, held hostage by an untethered, narcissistic prime minister and an end of days coalition. Now, all of this is kind of, in a sense, self-evidently true. But I think it's really important that you do have senior and sensible figures saying this. What is depressing in that context is that supporters of Israel, and that these days means especially Washington, until very recently, till the beginning of this month, that included this British government as well, but no longer. But Washington, they gave standing ovations to somebody for whom the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has requested an indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And US Congress kind of deliberately close, not all, of course, but there was quite a few people in that chamber giving him a standing ovation. And I would really like each of those members of Congress to be forced to read this Haaretz piece.
Although 80%...
Why do you think you are supporting Israel? What you're supporting is a completely mad prime minister.
Yeah.
That's two very, very different things.
I think 80% of Democrats stayed away from that speech.
Yes, so it was along party lines. That's absolutely correct. And one of the Democrats who was in the chamber, Rashida Tlaib, held up a placard saying "war criminal." Good on her. Yeah. And Kamala Harris, who's president of the Senate, had a unbreakable commitment in Indiana that day. So you're absolutely right. It was the Republicans, but nonetheless, there were some Democrats in the chamber, and incredible that any Democratic party, for example, any party in an electoral democracy could behave like that, really.
Let's talk about the Democrats and Kamala, who makes me smile these days.
Does.
She's so smiley, isn't she?
She's so smiley, and there's all of these memes, the whole thing, each time she chuckles with that weird... Trump tries to mock her, calling her Laughing Kamala, but actually it's glorious, the joy that she seems to have within herself and bring to others. I think for many of us, certainly for me personally, this side of the Atlantic, it's been puzzling reading those endless things about how unpopular she was, but also fascinating how quickly the weather can change and people just leaning into her again and again. And it's kind of all of this for me is a lesson more generally about how things change in mood. So in this country, in Britain, never mind what your political affiliations are, it's incredible to see how opinion polls show that people feel more optimistic quite suddenly when a rather less insane government comes in. So the piece that I've looked at from the New York Times, which I just loved, is called "Liberal White Dudes Rally for Harris." It's like a rainbow of beige. So this picks up, and the way that she's brought together, first it was the black women, then black and South Asian men. She, of course, is partly of South Asian heritage herself. Then white women. That one was called Karens for Harris. All of this, both the humour and underlying that, bringing each of these rallies, vast Zoom calls, have brought in millions and millions of dollars. And so the last and culminating one, I feel, is White Dudes for Harris and the rainbow of beige. And I think it's so funny that they've managed as far as we can see, the Trump-Vance campaign doesn't know where to turn. They were so happy at creating their headlines, which unsettled the other side again and again and again and again over recent years, because they broke every barrier, every kind of normal norm, and seemed to revel in doing it. And suddenly that's all been turned on them. And I just love the idea of identity politics, which is this thing they complain about. And you have White Dudes for Harris. That, for
Fantastic.
me, is one of the nicest things I've seen, because you can imagine how infuriated Trump and his gang will be at that.
Absolutely.
None of us know if this can still translate into victory in November, but it's we're living through amazing times.
We really are. And we'll be talking about Trump and his campaign in just a moment with Scott Lucas. Steve, thank you very much indeed.
It was a pleasure to be here.
That's Steve Crawshaw there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Venezuelans are taking to the streets in protest of Nicolas Maduro's claiming a win at the country's polls. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado says they have 73% of the voting tallies, proving they have the victory. Peru has kicked out Venezuela's diplomats in reaction to Maduro's victory claim, and the US is threatening sanctions. US Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's campaign will launch a $10 million advertising blitz in 6 battleground states this week as it tries to counter a surge of voter enthusiasm and donations for his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. By Sunday, Harris's campaign had raised $200 million in new campaign funds. And Morocco's King Mohammed VI has ordered the release of 3 jailed journalists as part of a pardon benefiting 2,476 convicts. This is a humane gesture on the 25th anniversary of the King's reign, annulling prison sentences while maintaining the rights of victims, a source said. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Just coming coming up to 8:34 in Zurich. That's 2:34 in Washington, D.C. JD Vance, the Ohio senator and Donald Trump's running mate in the upcoming election, made an unfortunate remark in a 2021 interview with Fox News host Tucker Carlson.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
This is how women with or without children, cat owners and indeed dog owners too, have reacted.
There are people who have chosen not to have children for whatever reason. There are people who want to have children who cannot. How dare you?
I am hearing from so many girlfriends, lifelong Republicans, that are so offended.
The Swifties, they are coming out in full force. Hell hath no fury like a certain childless cat lady who is yet to endorse a presidential candidate.
Well, listening to that with me is Scott Lucas, who's adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. Scott, many thanks for joining us. Vance's ratings are at a record low, and that remark will have annoyed women across the political spectrum. Can you tell us about his current figures?
Normally, Georgina, when you name a vice presidential nominee, whether it's Democrat or Republican, you get a bump in support. When the Republicans, or rather Donald Trump, tapped JD Vance a couple weeks ago, both his personal popularity and the popularity of the Trump campaign dropped. In other words, he was a drag on the campaign almost immediately, in part because of those comments you just played, and because I think of what is going to be one of the defining factors in this year's election, which is going to be the votes of independent women. Women's rights, reproductive rights will be, I think, probably the Democrats' main issue or one of the leading issues, given the Supreme Court's attack on those rights. We know that Donald Trump has problematic relations with women. So naming another white guy, a white guy who doesn't bring gender balance, who doesn't bring racial balance, who effectively is Trump 2.0 as your vice president, that was a serious mistake that Trump made even before Joe Biden stepped aside from the race.
I mean, would he still have been Trump's pick, do you think, if he had known then that Biden wouldn't be on the ticket?
This is a really interesting question because there's two aspects of the Trump campaign. There's Trump's advisors and there's Donald Trump. And I think Trump's advisors probably would have taken a hard look and thought maybe Elise Stefanik, who was the former Republican moderate, who's now a hardline Trumpist. She's the number 3 House Republican, would have been a good pick. I think they could have gone, in another direction with Tim Scott for racial balance. He's the black senator from South Carolina. But then there's Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump gets bedded in with someone who he sees on TV, especially Fox, and thinks, that's my guy, then he plays the former reality TV star from The Apprentice and he taps him. And there may have been no way of stopping Trump from picking Vance, whether or not Biden was in the race.
Scott, we don't have a great deal of time, but just to look at the man himself a bit more closely. I mean, it's made much easier by the fact that he's written a memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. Have you read it?
I have.
Me too.
It wasn't the most enlightening read, despite its bestseller popularity.
Do you know what?
I'll tell you what I got out of that. Yeah. Let me tell you what I got out of that. You first.
It made me understand why people vote for Trump.
It did, but here's the irony, and this is the way I'd start looking at Vance when we have more time. There are two JD Vances.
Yeah.
The JD Vance who published Hillbilly Elegy in 2016, the former journalist for the military, the venture capitalist. He was a man who published that in terms of the working class were being screwed over by all politicians, Democrat, Republican, and in his text, his private text and his public comments, Donald Trump was one of those politicians screwing over the working class. He called him a moron. He called him America's Hitler. The JD Vance of 2024 doesn't call Trump those names. He made himself as a Trumpist, primarily out of political ambition because he wanted to become in the U.S. Senate. And when he did so, he gave up defense of the working class to defense of Donald Trump. One fact, JD Vance's rating from the AFL-CIO, the U.S. labor unions, in terms of his voting record for working class rights in Congress is 0%. Not 20, not 10, not 5, Zero.
So that being said, and before we leave the subject of the book, I should just point out, in all fairness to Vance, that the stuff about the sofa is not true.
Yes.
It's not in the book. He did not have sexual relations with that piece of furniture. Is it too late to switch him out?
No. I mean, look, we went through this with the Democrats in terms of how late is too late to switch out Joe Biden, and the Democrats made the move in the nick of time. The last vice presidential candidate who had to withdraw at a late stage in the race was Tom Eagleton, the 1972 Democratic vice presidential candidate, because of mental health issues. That wasn't the primary reason why the Democrats lost, but they got absolutely thumped by Richard Nixon. Donald Trump doubled down on Trumpism when he named JD Vance, who is the remade Trumpist. If Trump dumps Vance, then he's dumping that Trumpist sign, including to the group you heard from your previous guest, the white dudes. It will show the Democrats being on a high and the Trump campaign being in a further scramble with 3.5 months to go before the election.
Scott, thank you so much. That's Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And now to the Swiss city of Vernier, where, as of last Friday, a famous face or enticing product will never again be plastered across the city walls. In a move which may act as a blueprint for other places across Switzerland, the city has opted for a total ban on outdoor advertising. To find out more about why Vernier citizens are bidding goodbye to billboards, Monocle's Paige Reynolds caught up with Alex Masouris from Monocle's very own design and branding agency, Wink Creative. She began by asking Alex to explain exactly what the ban means.
At surface level, they've basically banned billboards in the town of Vernier. Vernier, suburb of Geneva, about 38,000 people, and the council has decided to remove all commercial ads from streets, and that's anything visible from public land, including if it's on private property. So I could see them getting into some difficulties in figuring out how to enforce and take that one on. It also looks like Bern and Zurich are potentially to follow with some of the legislations of their own, so potentially a bit of a domino effect we're about to see here in Switzerland from the actions of Vernier.
Yeah, interesting. And I think we'll get on to Bern and to Zurich, who also might make a similar move, but for slightly different reasons, which we will discuss. But the debate in Vernier has largely been about what advertising constitutes a part of free competition for brands and companies, businesses, and what constitutes visual pollution. As someone who works in branding, advertising, adjacent, talk us through here what that debate really looks like. And it's not the first time billboards have been banned under that visual sort of pollution thread as well. So yeah, give us a sense.
Exactly. And I think putting my economics hat on for a second here, thinking about the free competition component of it, as long as everybody is playing by the same rules, competition is fair and free. So I don't quite follow that side of the argument. But whenever you're talking about visual pollution, I think there are many different ways to attack this problem if it's definitely seen that there's an issue with the billboards and what's being shown here. Removing it all seems like a drastic measure, and there's a lot of good information that I think citizens, regular folks, could get from billboards and advertising. And there are different things like establishing standards for the types of messages and designs that are being put on billboards. I mean, Switzerland has a really rich tradition of poster art, functional typographic posters that, similar to the way that different towns and cities enforce measures around facades and buildings, having a design code around the types of billboards and ads that you can create in public space, to me would be a more interesting and challenging way for them to approach this, as opposed to saying, well, all visual billboards ads in common space are ugly, let's just throw them all in the bin. I think that's a little drastic and maybe a little narrow-sighted.
For me, the interesting thing about this story as well is that it's about outdoor advertising. It's about physical advertising at a time when we are being constantly bombarded by smart ads and targeted ads on whenever we open our laptops and our phones. So it's kind of interesting to see a city take such a drastic stance, right, when it really seems like the problem with being bombarded by ads in the online space feels a little bit more extreme.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the concern is now, I mean, we still have a whole advertising industry here to think about. You have designers, media planners, buyers, that those jobs, well, one, could be in jeopardy, but otherwise they're still sitting on these ad budgets from companies, and a lot of that will get funneled into more aggressive and more targeted digital advertising on those channels. I think the role of our towns, cities, and governments should try to be keeping our heads up and looking at our surroundings and engaging in the real world around us. I think maybe this measure might be pushing people more towards their screens.
Yeah, 100%. That's interesting. I hadn't quite thought about how it could get worse online because it's so bad already. But it looks like Vernier is not going to be the only place in Switzerland that might introduce legislation like this or introduce a ban. It looks like other cities might be using this as a blueprint. We reference Bern and Zurich. So it looks like it could happen there, but they're also concerned with something slightly different.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Zurich, obviously a city that we here at Midori House at Monocle are very familiar with and love very much. I like that their approach is looking at digital screens particularly. One, they're taking an angle from energy usage. It's costly and expensive. Frankly, though, I just think the digital screens out in the real world are kind of ugly. They look out of place. They don't seem to fit environment as well as some of the print ads that you see. And also, we get enough of our digital screens at work and in our phones. I think I'm okay with not having to see them at the bus stop or around every corner in the airport.
So I guess there's that energy angle as well. Finally, I kind of wanted to ask you, again, putting your advertising, branding hat on, what is the value for brands at this kind of moment in advertising for something like a billboard? Do you think a large conglomerate or even a small local business can use a billboard and still kind of galvanize people to be more interested in their product, to buy the product? What do you think people are engaging in physical advertising in the same way that they used to, and that it's still a good investment for brands?
I definitely think it is. I don't think that the invention of digital advertising, targeted social media ads have changed the way that we necessarily engage with things in our physical world. If anything, I think we come to appreciate some of the things in the physical world a bit more whenever we do notice them. The one thing that advertisers really gain with physical ads is they know they capture somebody at a time and place. And that's a real life moment, not a digital trigger. And with that, you can really hone your message for your audience. Think of the cheeky ads we see on the tube. Think of some large billboard displays that have a catchy line or really stand out amongst the skyline. So I do think that there's a lot of value and creativity that brands get to play with in physical billboard, poster style advertising you don't necessarily get with digital ads.
Many thanks there to Wing Creative's Alex Masouras in conversation with Monocle's Paige Reynolds. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now we're going to shine the spotlight on Norway now with Tonje Iversen, who's UK correspondent for Norwegian broadcasters TV2 and P4. She joins us on the line now. Tonje, welcome to Monocle Radio. We're going to start off with poor old Princess Martha Louise. She's long been a very controversial figure. What's she up to now?
Yes, so the Norwegian princess is being investigated over her role in a commemorative wedding gin. The princess will marry the American businessman, alternative therapist and self-professed shaman Durek Verrett in a wedding in Norway next month. And she is not permitted to use her princess title in commercial context. But the couple now face heavy criticism and are under investigation by health authorities over the launch of a wedding gin that used their names and a monogram and referred to a title on the label. Because 2 years ago, Princess Märtha Louise renounced her official royal duties. Her father, King Harald, decided that she could keep her royal title, but she then pledged to make clear the difference between her business activities and her role as a member of the royal family. That meant that she could not use her title in connection with commercial activity. Now, a spokesperson for the princess has described the inclusion of her title on the label as a mistake and said that it would be removed. But according to a letter from the gin producer seen by the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten, the couple were involved in the process of designing the label. Also, according to the producer, it was the princess' own idea to make the gin for the wedding and to sell it on the open market. And the Norwegian Directorate of Health has said they won't comment on the issue until they reach a conclusion in August or September. And the princess' wedding is, of course, due to begin on the 29th of August.
I interviewed her once and she'd spent a very long time telling me about her angel guides and the angel school she used to run in Norway, and indeed a book she'd written with somebody else all about how she communicated with angels. And I believe that her new husband, her husband-to-be, they say that they met in a former life when they were an Egyptian pharaoh and his queen. So presumably that means they will now live happily ever after. I can only wish her joy. Let's talk about this fossil fuel frenzy and Norway's green image.
Yes, Norway is, of course, facing an increasing amount of criticism as an oil nation. Climate activists and organizations such as Greenpeace are calling Norway a climate hypocrite. Many Norwegians do drive electrical cars and use heat pumps to warm their houses. And the Norwegian government also donate money to save trees in the rainforest and are trying to put pressure on other countries to protect the environment. But this is seen as a massive paradox by some, that Norway dig up more petroleum per person than Russians, Iranians, North Americans and Saudi Arabians. But at the same time, the country is adopting clean energy technologies faster than anyone else. And also, of course, the government continues to license fossil fuel extraction projects. Norwegian politicians are often confronted with this, and often the defense is that the world still needs oil and gas, and that Norway's fossil fuels are produced more cleanly and with higher ethical standards than those of many other countries that produce oil, and that Norwegian gas provide energy security, especially with the situation in Europe at the time.
Yeah, well, and Norwegians themselves are feeling very guilty about this, according to another piece. Elizabeth Oxfeldt says that she's a professor of Scandinavian literature at Oslo University. She says wealthy Norwegians are increasingly contrasting their comfortable lives with those of people who are struggling, particularly overseas. Tell us more about this.
Yes, Norwegians are often reminded about how lucky they are. And in Norway, you have very strong workers' rights, strong unions. There's a strong welfare state. We have free health care. And most higher education institutions in Norway are funded by the Ministry of Education and Research and don't charge tuition fees. But The professor Oxfeld, she has looked at contemporary culture, TV show, literature, films, and she found that the contrast between the happy, fortunate and privileged self and the suffering other brought about feelings of guilt, unease, discomfort and shame. She says that not everyone feels guilty, but many do. And examples of plots featured in recent Norwegian dramas include women who realize that they have achieved gender equality in the workplace by relying on low-paid au pairs from poor countries to care for their children. And interestingly, in March, the Norwegian government actually put a stop to granting work permits for au pairs from the developing world. So the Norwegian people's guilt trips have also been triggered by a variety of organizations eager to question whether Norway's wealth is based on ethical practices, also just as we talked about the oil industry.
Absolutely. Tonya, thank you very much for joining us. That's Tonya Iverson there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, let's head to Paris, where Monocle has decamped to bring you 2 weeks of live radio. In just a few minutes, Emma Nelson will be here to bring you today's Monocle in Paris, but she joins me now from Maison Alliance in Paris, in your very hot rooftop box, Emma.
Yes, a little bit. It's cooler than yesterday. Bonjour,
bonjour,
bonjour. I think that's how we're supposed to kick it off. Ça va très bien. Yeah, we're doing very well. Final preparations being made. It's amazing how coffee can be produced from nowhere in France. And so we've all turned up this morning, and before we knew it, we've just got bags, buckets and buckets of coffee. Final preparations, scripts being printed, and guests are arriving for what promises to be quite a lovely hour of radio from 9 a.m. here in Paris, 8 a.m. where you are in London.
And tell us what's on the show.
Well, we've got a bit of a design special this morning. We've got some really, really special guests. We have a gentleman called Mathieu Lehanner, who, I don't know if you saw the Olympic torch and the very, very beautiful balloon that floated up into the sky. He designed it. And so we're going, and we have a torch as well, which obviously is absolutely no use to you if you're on the radio, unless you describe it really, really well.
Or in the dark,
Or in the dark. And we have a very wonderful German lady called who's come and cleaned the torch and got the torch out of the cupboard, and has she's also disinfected the torch because of the number of hands that have been across this torch. Apparently it was the one that was sent in Marseille. So we have a torch to play with. He's going to talk to us about the beautiful balloon, the Montgolfier, which is sort of being actually one of the main attractions in Paris now. It's become one of the big surprises that the public can apply for 10,000 up to 10,000 tickets to go and see the balloon that's floating in the Tuileries Gardens at the moment. And apparently they have sold out. I think they're like even hotter than some of the Olympic events. And then we'll be extremely, extremely lucky to be joined by the man who is kind of in charge of making Paris 2024 look the way it does, Joachim Rancin. He creates the Olympics visual image. He designed the logo. He's been handing out pins. There's a lot of pins here in Paris. So we've all been handed out little badges that we can put on our lapels for the next 6 months. So there's a lovely feeling here that we're going to be talking about the creative side and the ideas that bring the Olympics together and brings Paris together, and how you create, how you sort of refresh something which is, which goes on for decades and decades and decades, and how you actually make Paris distinct and beautiful, but also to key into all the wonderful heritage that the Olympics bring.
Absolutely. And I understand that you'll also be speaking to some people from the jewellery sector.
Yes, so this is the other side of Paris design that is absolutely gorgeous. A gentleman called Com Melerio is going to be coming in, and he is from the Melerio family, who I think in the early 17th century opened the world's first jewellery house. And they were doing the baubles for Marie Antoinette. Apparently she noticed a Signor Melerio wandering around near to where she was in Paris. And they opened a jewellery store near the Rue du Bac, I think that their jewellery store still is. And so it'd be interesting to find out how you make something which has such beautiful heritage and how you design for the future and for a contemporary audience. And of course, things like jewellery have always been used to mark major historical events. If you collect antique jewellery, you'll see things which have sort of marking coronations and this, that and the other. So we'll be interested to find out what you do when you have an Olympics on your doorstep.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. And as she said, you can join her right after this programme in just a couple of minutes, in fact, to hear more from Emma and from our whole team there in Paris. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Henry Rees-Sheridan, Paige Reynolds and Monica Lillis, our researcher, Gunnar Gronlid, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons. Coming up at the top of the hour, it's our second edition of Monocle in Paris, and the briefing is live at midday. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.